Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover three topics. First, the apparent momentum behind Kamala Harris's unexpected presidential campaign. Second, the Trudeau government's latest case of large-scale public subsidies for the electric vehicle industry. And third, David's interesting proposal to push back Canada's August-long weekend holiday till later in the month. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
We last spoke on August 2nd, just as Kamala Harris had become the Democratic Party's official presidential candidate. The campaign that she inherited was running behind Donald Trump at that time. Less than 2 weeks later, and she seems to have a national lead, including in some key swing states. David, what's happened?
Both a lot and nothing at all. So here's my theory of the campaign, and it's been my theory of every American election since 2016, which is the question is blah, 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 Donald Trump, blah, blah, blah. And the answer is 46, yes, maybe sometimes 47, never more than 47, 50, 51, 52, sometimes even 53, no. That 46, 53 math got suppressed by Biden's infirmity in the past year. And with Biden out of the picture and a more energetic Democratic alternative coming forward, the math that was always there has reemerged. It's re-energized, it's reemerged. I don't think that it's that Harris has done something so remarkable to summon all of this into being. I think it was just waiting for the spark. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is not like other campaigns. One of the questions that journalists talk about is, well, what can Trump do to change it? And my view about that is really nothing. That how people feel about Donald Trump has been set in place for a long time, and he benefited from the inactivity of the lack of cohesion of the majority against him. But as it reassembles, I just think that's what we're seeing is what was always there.
One of the big developments over these past 2 weeks is Harris's selection of Minnesota Governor Tim Waltz as her running mate. Thus far, he's shown himself to be an effective communicator. How, if at all, has his pick contributed to the Democrats gaining ground?
I'm not sure very much. I think he's sort of more like a normal figure. The J.D. Vance pick does seem to have had a depressive effect on Trump. One of the things that it's obvious when you say it, but people often, especially people on the right-hand side of politics, often forget it, is the median voter is a woman. When you pick someone who has spent the past 3 years in politics, since as a candidate for Senate, then a senator, mostly coming with ideas to criticize and surveil women, that's a problem. And I think that what J.D. Vance is just running into is a lot of people hearing about him for the first time, discovering what his brand is, and thinking, that sounds like it's aimed at me. No, thank you. So I think he matters. I suspect Waltz is more like the typical vice presidential pick, which is, it helps rev up the base, but it probably doesn't matter that much for the undecided voter who may not even know. There are these polls that ask people, what is the name of the vice president? And depending on how the question is phrased, usually somewhere between 50% and 70% know, but somewhere between 30 and 50% don't know.
David, we've previously discussed the extent to which progressives risk alienating themselves from swing voters over ideological stuff, like opposing fracking or succumbing too much to identity politics. One of the sources of Joe Biden's own appeal was that he understood this. What about Harris? She seemed to fall into that trap in the 2020 presidential primary. Can she resist it now?
Yeah. The critique that she's going to get is that she's a big flip-flopper. Looks like there's a lot of truth to that critique, but it may not be damning, because if you flip from something people don't like to flop to something they like better, and if you can convince them, no, this time I really mean it, then it might do you some good, especially because I think she had such a weak identity before. I don't imagine there are many people, even people who are quite attentive to politics, who would answer with great confidence if you said, well, what does Kamala Harris really believe? What does she really stand for? That would have been a pretty hazy question even 2 months ago. So I think there's a lot of room to reinvent. Remember the Etch-a-Sketch from 2012? One
Yes.
of Mitt Romney's advisors was asked. Romney, who was like kind of a moderate, good government guy, had taken these severely conservative stances to win the Republican nomination, and his
Self-described
campaign
so.
advisor was asked, "What?"
Self-described so. Recall at CPAC, he referred to himself as a severe conservative of all
Yes,
things.
exactly. Not quite getting the, and his closest advisors asked, "Well, what are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, you know that Etch-a-Sketch game where you shake it up and redraw the image." Um, and I think people, I mean, you're not supposed to say that, but I think Harris has a lot of opportunity to do that.
In that vein, David, as you set out earlier, Canadians have a pretty good sense of what they can expect from a Donald Trump presidency. What about a Kamala Harris presidency? What might it mean for Canadian economic and national security interests, or do we know at this point?
Well, this nicely segues into our next topic. So, from a Canadian point of view, one of the negatives for Donald Trump was he ran the most protectionist administration the United States has seen since 1945. In second place, the Joe Biden administration has been the second most protectionist administration since 1945. And there's a lot of risk that this will continue. And Biden administration protectionism has taken the form both of penalties on imported goods, especially from China, but also massive subsidies to domestic producers through the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not clear that these Biden subsidies are legal under the agreements of the World Trade Organization. They are being challenged by many American trading partners, but the World Trade Organization doesn't always move fast.
Yes.
And subsidies are in place and spewing money all over the American landscape. And Canadian governments have responded by, if you can't beat them, joining
Yes.
them, having Canadian subsidies on a massive scale, tens of billions of dollars and counting. And the latest example, which we were going to talk about, is this benefits my neighbors in Napanee, and good luck to them. And I wish Napanee nothing but but success. But there's going to be a subsidized new factory in Napanee that'll produce some jobs, but cost the taxpayers a lot of money. And the results of these subsidies are often quite disappointing.
Well, precisely right. And I should say that yesterday's announcement involving the Trudeau government at the national level and the Ford government at the Ontario level to Goodyear Tire for the expansion of the production plant for electric vehicles is really just a drop in the bucket. According to analysis that we've published at the Hub, the total value of subsidies for the electric vehicle industry is now more than $50 billion and counting. This week, David, Prime Minister Trudeau referred to these unprecedented public subsidies as, quote, a strategic decision to be a leader in EV supply chains, unquote. What do you think of that decision?
Well, people who favor this approach think there's something new and exciting about excluding imports and having government direct where investment dollars go. And it's not new, and it's certainly not exciting. But it responds to a genuine problem that a mid-sized economy like Canada faces. During the old era of the trade infrastructure built after World War II, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, as it was known, was in place from the end of the war until the 1990s. And the GATT mostly focused on lowering tariffs.
Yes.
But by the 1990s, it was clear that the problem, the obstruction to trade, was not so much the tariffs that were imposed, but special favors, non-tariff barriers to imports, and subsidies to domestic industry. And so the new World Trade Organization, and even more importantly, these regional agreements like NAFTA, were supposed to suppress these trade distorting non-tariff barriers. And that regime has just imploded over the past half dozen years. And the Biden administration has now completely jettisoned it. So it's not mysterious that with Canada's most important trading partner saying, we're back in the subsidy game, that Canada would say, okay, well, we have to follow. The problem is, of course, Canada cannot possibly win at the subsidy game. And the juice for Canada is recalling important trading partners, especially the Americans, the British, the European Union, and the Japanese, to a discovery of why these distortions are so harmful. And it's hard to do that when your government is selling them to its own people as beneficial.
Yes.
This is at very best, at remote very best, a dismal substitute for true free trade. And it may be a lot worse than that. Maybe just a gigantic waste of money, spending tens of billions of dollars to create a few thousand jobs.
I would just say in
Um,
parentheses for Canadian listeners and viewers participating in our conversation today that there's reports this week that the Kamala Harris campaign has recently added Brian Deese as a key economic advisor. He was someone who served in the Biden administration and played something of an intellectual role in the development of this more interventionist industrial policy model that we've seen take off under the Biden administration and now is being followed by the Trudeau government.
and you want to say about this model? Look, I'm not saying that it's impossible that it could ever succeed, because it is true that you probably can, with enough ingenuity and effort, build an airplane made of concrete. But it usually doesn't succeed. Airplanes made of concrete usually don't land very happily. And the energy for the next decade really needs to go into getting rid of these non-tariff barriers, creating true free trade spaces, not distorting trade with non-tariff barriers and with subsidies, and especially in the NAFTA zone, trying to eliminate, at least between the three NAFTA partners, trying to get rid of them to the maximum extent possible.
It's fascinating insights, David. It's worth mentioning that we're having this conversation just weeks after the end of the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference, which occurred in July 1944, which in some ways was the genesis of the GATT, a model that served the world rather well for several decades. How do we go about reinvigorating a global trading system that minimizes these distortions and instances of protectionism, and can it be done without China's participation?
Well, if we means Canadians, then stick to the limited scope of NAFTA. And Canada should be working very hard with the United States and with Mexico in the face of adverse political developments, because in both countries you have you have a new president in Mexico who is going to be an avid subsidizer, and if Kamala Harris wins, both Trump and Harris are subsidizers. A lot of people want to have government make investment decisions, but Canadians should be working hard, and this has been a traditional role of Canadian diplomacy, to say that this is injurious to everybody. It's true, it's more injurious to Canada than to the others, but it's injurious to everybody. Let's find a way to stop it, and let's at least try to have market-driven decisions within North America. If we means people of goodwill, then look, it's going to be hard to make the WTO work in the face of the present dispositions of the Chinese government. They're not good playmates. So what we're going to need, and this is something the Biden administration before it, and now the Harris administration after it, seem unwilling to do, we're going to need to reinvigorate the regional trade process. We need to bring back things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the prospect of a US-UK agreement or a NAFTA-UK agreement, and the transatlantic partnership with the EU, and to say, these subsidies are so destructive, so distorting, at least between friends. Can we not find some way to be rid of them?
As you may know, David, we're currently having a debate in Canada, including among conservatives, about whether to impose tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports. As a matter of fact, we published an article at the Hub this week calling on the government to move forward with such tariffs. I've been looking forward to ask you what you think. I'm inclined towards a tough line on China in national security cases, but I find it a bit tough to convince myself that electric vehicles require national security protection. What's your view?
So my view is, I don't know all the details of the case, and there may be arguments I'm overlooking, but my instinct is no. If it has to happen, and again, my instinct is no, if it has to happen, it should happen in a coordinated way with NAFTA partners. If China is such a problem, they are so big and important, country by country responses are not going to work. The more worried you are about China, the more important it is to assemble the NAFTA bloc, plus the EU, plus Britain, plus Japan, plus other partners, into some kind of like-minded network, where that together we we write for ourselves some rules about what is a proper subsidy and what is not, what is a valid health and safety barrier, and what is just an excuse for protectionism. And then confront China with a united front to the extent possible. But the world is very big, and Canada is not big enough to impose its will on it. And there are always a lot of fashionable arguments of the day for protectionism, but in the end, it's the same old method. And the reason protectionism is bad is that it punishes people inside the country, and not just consumers. Not just it raises the prices of goods and services. We're very conscious of that. You make electric cars more expensive. But every output is somebody else's input. An electric vehicle is an output for the electric car industry, but it's an input for the truck leasing industry. It's an input for food delivery. It's an input for everyone who uses a vehicle of any kind, and you raise all of their costs. So what you're doing is you're systematically making your economy less efficient. The real harm of protectionism is it just distorts every decision made all through the economy. It makes everybody less efficient. It makes everybody less smart. It makes everybody less capable. And yes, it raises costs to consumers too, and imposes a tax precisely on the people who can are least well positioned to bear it. So my instinct is always no, if you can avoid it. If you must do it, though, do it in conjunction with trading partners so that it sticks. And then make sure that there is as big a zone of as much free trade as possible, if assuming China really is the intractable problem. And I've said this before, and never stop hoping that we can pull China onto the path. Well, this is going to be a much better century if the Chinese will be good neighbors than if they are bad neighbors. This is not the Soviet Union, which was an economic pit. Anyway, they had even if they behaved well, they had little to contribute to the world because their economy is so disorganized. If China can be pulled onto the path of good behavior, they have a lot to contribute to the well-being of the world. So let's never give up hope that we can make that happen, even as we prudently hedge our bets and prepare that it may not happen.
Yeah, well said. What a brilliant answer. Before we turn to our final topic, let me put a question to you that I actually put to Oren Cass, a proponent of protectionism and other state interventions on our regular podcast last week. If you were to establish a framework, David, to make judgments about which sectors are indeed ones worthy of national security protection and which ones aren't, how should you think about that? How do you distinguish between, say, semiconductors on one hand and T-shirt production on the other hand? What are the types of factors that would go into making those judgments so as to ensure that it doesn't become an exercise in rent-seeking and politicization?
Well, you begin by starting with the assumption the answer is no. And then we say, and as I say, you begin with the assumption the answer is no. And where the answer is yes, like with weapons, then you say, okay, now we have to have a really serious policy of cooperating with major alliance partners, with NATO allies. So for whatever barriers applies to weapons production from China or weapons inputs from China certainly should not apply to the European Union, to Japan, to Great Britain. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are a lot of ways of protecting yourself strategically without subsidies and protectionism. For example, one of the things the Biden administration did was put barriers in place on medical imports because in case of in a pandemic, these medical goods become strategic. And so they want to subsidize medical production. Wait a minute. You could also buy 10 billion pairs of rubber gloves from the cheapest supplier and put them under a mountain somewhere and stockpile them. That it's not always clear that subsidizing the rubber glove maker, much as the rubber glove maker is pressing you to do it, is the correct answer. So I would be looking at every turn. Is there a way to achieve this strategic goal, either with a very broad-based procurement area or by doing something other than subsidizing, like stockpiling, maybe like with 155 millimeter artillery shells, which have been so much in the news? Is the right answer have your own subsidized U.S. factories? Or is the right answer that in conjunction with the United States and NATO partners and others, you just it turns out you need buy a lot of them and put them under a mountain somewhere. And if you never need them, that is such a relief. You've saved, if the war doesn't come, not having the war is such a saving of resources that the money you wasted accumulating the supply you never use, you'll be happy at that economy. But protectionism basically is always the worst, least efficient way to obtain the end. So you want to avoid it if there's any reasonable way you can.
Many of our Canadian listeners and viewers recently enjoyed the August-long weekend. But David, you have a quirky yet compelling proposal to move it back later in the month. Why don't you outline your case?
Um, the 8th of August is not only the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon's announcement of his resignation from office, but it's also the anniversary of the greatest military victory in Canadian history. Canadians grow up on the memory of Vimy Ridge in 1917, which Canadians cherish because it was an all-Canadian show. But months later, in August of 1918, Canadians at the same, in conjunction and partnership with Australians and within the context of a larger British army, spearheaded the Battle of Amiens, where they broke the German army in the west, achieved the largest one-day gains in frontage to that point in the war, and started the 100 days that ended in victory in World War I. And I've always thought that August 8th, it was a great teaching opportunity to encourage Canadians to understand better their shared history. We've talked a lot over our episodes about democracy, which comes from the Greek concept of the people rule. But for the people to rule, you need a concept of a people. And that has really been under fire in Canada recently. And so I've had a long-time proposal that the weekend closest to the 8th of August should be renamed, because we have this generic like holiday day or Simcoe Day or TK Day, your local hero insert here day, and have pan-Canadian holiday of Victories Day, which would Remembrance Day on November 11th would be the day that you remember the sacrifices of war, the suffering, and why you want to avoid it if you can. And then the weekend closest to the 8th of August would be Victories Day, the day you remember Canada's incredibly important and sacrificing contributions to world freedom in 2 world wars, in Korea, and in other conflicts. And it would be a day to remember what Canada has given to the world, what Canadians owe to each other, what Canadians owe to their past. And it would be a way to counter this recent trend to denigrate the Canadian past and instead to celebrate it.
Well, just very compelling, as I say it. And one of the lines of argument that you've made in favor of this change that I find persuasive is something that you alluded to there, which is to say the United States presently has Memorial Day to recognize those who've made the ultimate sacrifice, but Veterans Day to celebrate the extraordinary military valor and enormous contribution to the values like democracy and all of the rest that we so care about. And yet we're lacking that second day as part of our civic life.
Well, there has been, I want to avoid always anything boastful and anything that glorifies conflict. And one of the, a trend that I have heartily approved of is when these anniversaries, 0 number anniversaries for the D-Day celebrations roll around, the recent practice of including Germany, Italy, Hungary, people on the other side of the war in the conflict, to say, you know what, from today's perspective, I mean, that this was also a day of liberation for you. Maybe most of all, a day of liberation for you. And it's a day where we celebrate the conversion of the European continent into a zone of freedom and partnership. And so the idea is nothing vainglorious, nothing boastful, but to remember when those Canadians fought in those wars and suffered so terribly, they were doing it literally for the people alive today. We reap the benefit. So it would be a good day to say thank you.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap up our conversation today. I want to thank you, David, for helping me think through a bunch of different issues, including the one we've just discussed. And I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.